Hello, everyone, and welcome to the California Department of Education's Literacy Knowledge Building video series. In this video, Dr. Laura Reinhardt from the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at the University of California, Los Angeles will discuss how we can make reading instruction accessible for all elementary school students. Before we begin, let's go over a brief bit of background on the Literacy Knowledge video series. This series is a series of videos on critical topics in literacy, birth through grade 12. It was developed by the California Department of Education and literacy experts in the state literacy team, and it is complementary to the work of the Federal Comprehensive Literacy State Development Grants. You can learn more about the CLSD grant by going to the California Department of Education's website and searching for CLSD. The purpose of this video series is to provide guidance and resources on critical topics in literacy, also to support the work of the CLSD grants, and finally to build coherence between California's literacy guidance documents, standards, and frameworks and how they all support literacy. A major objective of the CLSD grant is to bring coherence between California's guiding documents, some of which you see here, like the California Preschool Learning Foundations, the California Infant Toddler Learning and Development Foundations, the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities, the California Dyslexia Guidelines, and the English Learner Roadmap. Other content area standards and frameworks support the literacy as well. The videos produced in this series will illustrate the connections between all of these documents and also explain how the documents themselves support literacy development for our students. Videos will be produced over the course of the CLSD grant period. To be informed when new videos are posted, join the CLSD listserv by sending a blank email to join-california-state-development-program at mlist.cde.ca.gov. And now I will turn it over to Laura.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hello, my name is Laura Reinhardt, and I'm an assistant researcher at the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at UCLA. It's a privilege to be here talking with you about making reading instruction accessible for all elementary school students, including students with dyslexia. In this presentation, I will cover three main topics around elementary school students, reading development, early predictors, assessment, and interventions. By the end of this talk, you'll be able to answer these three questions. What are some early predictors of reading achievement? What kinds of assessments can identify students who need additional reading support? And what are some examples of these assessments? And last, what types of interventions or teaching strategies support elementary school students who are struggling to read? And again, what are some examples of these that you can use in your own classroom? So first, we're going to cover the kinds of literacy and pre-literacy skills that are associated with later proficient reading. In other words, what kind of skills do students that go on to be good readers exhibit in kindergarten and the early grades? To back up a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about what it means for data to be predictive. Research studies have shown that results from assessments like screeners that include a variety of subtests given to students in early grades like kindergarten or first grade can predict how they perform in reading several years later. For example, a student's knowledge of letter names at the beginning of kindergarten can predict how well they will read at the end of second grade. At the same time, I want to note that collecting several kinds of data from several different subtests or assessments at different time points is the most predictive. One measure at one time point isn't generally very predictive.
In the image on the screen, strands of rope representing language comprehension and word recognition are twined together. Language comprehension is comprised of background knowledge, facts and concepts, vocabulary, breadth, precision, and links, language structures, syntax and semantics, verbal reasoning, reference and metaphor, and literacy knowledge, print concepts, and genres. Word recognition is comprised of phonological awareness, syllables and phonemes, decoding, alphabetic principle, spelling sound correspondence, and sight recognition of familiar words. Phonological awareness in this image is circled.
Before we go further, I also want to go over the reading rope and how it relates to proficient reading and predicting proficient reading. So the reading rope shown here has two main strands. At the top, in the turquoise color, are skills that lead to reading for understanding. So background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. Things in this strand, especially vocabulary and background knowledge, are often developed at home and are more related to students' environment, so they can be more difficult to remediate in schools. However, the word recognition skills and the other parts of the orange rope are more receptive to interventions, and these are the skills I want to focus on in this talk. For example, phonological awareness is a strong predictor of students' reading abilities. So if we know about students' phonological awareness skills, we can predict their later reading skills because this skill is predictive of skilled reading. So again, phonological awareness is a skill that's associated with strong and fluent reading. So what do we mean by phonological awareness and how do we measure it? So phonological awareness is a skill that if students have this awareness, they understand that words are made of different sounds and that these sounds can be manipulated. So for this skill, the focus is really on sounds and not letters. For instance, even though the word 6 has 3 letters, it has 4 sounds, s, I, k, s. Students with phonological awareness skills can know that the word 6 has 4 sounds. So if you're going to do some phonological awareness exercises with that word, you would ask students what rhymes with 6. So they might come up with mix, tricks, slicks. And there you know that the spelling ending is different, but the sounds are the same. Another phonological awareness skill is blending. So taking the sounds of the word 6, giving them to the child, say s, I, k, s. What happens when you push those together and they know that's the word 6. The other way around can be segmenting, asking the child to break down those words into the individual sounds. And then finally, manipulating, which tends to be the most challenging for students, would be to change some of the sounds within the word. So for example, taking the word 6 and changing the I to ah would produce the word socks. So importantly, again, this is with sounds. So students don't need to know how to read words to do well on this task. They can play around with sounds before they know all of their letters and how to read. So as I go through these assessments, I want to note that I'm focusing on assessments in English, and there are validated versions of these assessments in other languages. Ideally, these assessments should be matched to students' home language and at least matched to a language they speak in order to get accurate information. Another predictive skill is letter sound knowledge. In this assessment, students are asked to match the sound to the symbol, hear letters. Although this is a basic assessment, of course, there are actually 44 sounds in the English language and only 26 letters. So this can be confusing for some students. For instance, some of the vowels make more than one sound, and then there are single sounds like ch and cheese that are one sound but represented by 2 letters. So if you gave this assessment to students and you showed them the letter C, of course, C can have 2 sounds, a soft C like a S sound or a hard C like a K sound. As long as kindergartners know one of those sounds, it's considered correct. And again, this being able to have this letter sound knowledge is predictive of students' later reading abilities. Another predictive skill is rapid automatized naming. So in this assessment or type of test, children go through a variety of objects. It can be letters, numbers, shapes, colors, and they try to go through as quickly as possible. And how quickly and accurately students can do this are noted. And the speed on this task is predictive of reading fluency, which is important for skilled reading.
On the slide, there are several nonsense words as examples: FIP, NOS, LIG, VAM, RIT, and BEP.
Another predictive skill that can be measured is nonsense word reading. So children in early grades can read a variety of words, and there are some words that they decode or sound out, but other words are sight words. So students read them without sounding them out. That could be a word like could. Also, the letters in that word don't really match on well to the sounds. And then there are also words that students have memorized, maybe a word like stop. They also don't sound it out, they just know that word. So this task provides nonsense words. And so we understand it can show us how students will read a word that they haven't seen before, which is why we choose words that aren't what we call real words. And this gives us an indication of how well students know the rules when it comes to reading. And this skill, again, is predictive of later reading skills. And as you know, as students get older, particularly in content areas like science, they'll end up seeing a lot of words they've never seen before. So they'll need to know the rules in order to read them correctly. So the type of assessments I've described here can show us which students might be at risk of experiencing reading challenges or struggle to read, even before they get into the grades where they are asked to read a lot. But I also want to note that finding students at risk of reading challenge can be complex. For instance, one large research study found that there are 4 kinds of struggling readers in first grade, not just one. So the first group of struggling readers were students who struggled with phonological awareness. The second group was students who struggled with rapid naming. The third group was students who struggled with letter sound knowledge. And the fourth group were students who struggled with a variety or multiple pre-reading skills. For the first 3, they did well on the other subtests, so they won't necessarily need support in those areas. And this is important. So knowing the type of skills that the students have can be important because it can tell teachers what to do next and which specific skills need intervention so that students don't spend time working on a skill that they've already mastered. So far, I focused on students in grades like kindergarten, first grade, and second grade, but older students also benefit from assessment. So for older students above second grade, you'd want to collect information on their oral reading fluency and comprehension. One strategy for doing this is to pick a passage at the student's independent or instructional reading level. If you're not sure about this, there are assessments online, one called the San Diego Quick, which is a good and fast way to get at students' independent or instructional grade level. And this can be useful because, for instance, if a student is in the 5th grade, but really their independent level is on at 3rd grade, you'd want to give them a passage at 3rd grade. So once you find a passage that's appropriate for the student, you can determine how many words correct they're reading per minute. And then for comprehension, you can ask questions about the story. Some of these passages come with their own comprehension questions, but you can also create your own. So if there's an expository text, you could ask about a main idea, or if there's a narrative text, you can ask some who, what, where questions. And from these types of assessments, you get not only fluency, how many words per minute students are reading correctly, but you can also find out about comprehension. And so if students are struggling with comprehension, this will tell you, and if you think back to the reading rope, is it background knowledge? It could be the top strand that's getting in the way. If it's about a topic they're not familiar with, that might impact comprehension, but it also could be decoding. So this type of assessment will give you a lot of information, not only about comprehension, but also about decoding. So some school districts already collect this kind of data. Some districts and schools screen students on a regular basis with the types of assessments I mentioned. But if your school or district doesn't do this, there are also some free tools online so that you can do this in your own classroom if that's something you'd like to do. One tool I recommend is DIBELS, or the Dynamic Indicators of Early Literacy Skills. These materials are available online for free, and DIBELS includes a lot of different measures depending on students' age and grade. So they have assessments for first sound fluency, or identifying the first sound in a word, which is a phonemic awareness exercise. Letter naming, like I mentioned earlier, phoneme segmentation, which is another phonological awareness assessment, nonsense word reading, and then they also offer some assessments for older children who are reading fluently, so oral reading, which gets at children's fluency, and then something they call DAYS, which measures students' comprehension. So here you can see in the bars are the different types of assessments. So depending on the grade level the student is in, this tells you which kinds of assessments you'll want to give to your students. So if you have kindergarten students, in the beginning of the year, you'll want to know about their initial sound fluency, letter naming, and word use fluency skills. But in fourth grade, you'd probably just want to give students the assessments that are oral reading fluency and retail fluency. And here you can see that ideally you would assess students several times a year. First, that gives the chance to tell if a student was just having an off day. And then also you'll be able to get some growth. So you can track students throughout the year to see if their skills are growing appropriately. So if you decide to use something like DIBELS and you test your whole class, you might see something like this. DIBELS will give 3 areas or 3 different labels to students' reading skills. So core means that the student is on track. Strategic means that you might want to focus or just keep an eye on the students. And then intensive with the red square means these are students that might benefit the most from interventions. So if you had the opportunity to work with a reading specialist or someone that worked in small groups with students, these are the students, the ones I circled, those are the ones that you would want to pull into those groups. And it is helpful to determine this type of template here can be helpful in determining small groups for tracking students. And in this way, the screening data can guide your instruction. And I want to note here that the names and IDs are fictional. So if you choose to pull a couple students into a small group, you can do progress monitoring with those students. DIBELS provides a number of assessments. This one are progress monitoring tools. So this one is for oral reading fluency. So for instance, if you had a 4th grader and you wanted to work with them on fluency, there would be a number of passages at that student's reading level. And each week they would read a passage, and we would hope to see and track the words correct per minute each week. And we'd hope to see consistent growth. And you can share this with the student to show them how well they're doing. And you can also focus on any sort of decoding or comprehension challenges you notice in the passages for instruction and intervention. And here again, the student name, school, and ID are fictional. So lastly, I want to cover interventions and the kinds of interventions that are helpful for students that are struggling with reading. And so I talked about in the beginning that the reading skills tend to be predictive. At the same time, interventions can change the trajectory for students. Here is a figure from a recent research study showing that different students had different outcomes depending on whether they were part of the treatment group that got the intervention or the control group that didn't receive an intervention or received what we call business as usual. So that means they just had the typical classroom instruction. So for students that did receive the intervention, they showed more progress. They had a steeper curve on growth, so they caught up to did much better than the students that did not receive the intervention. And this study showed that students that received intensive intervention in first grade made more growth than students that received a similar intervention in second grade. So early interventions and intensive interventions with 100 hours or so of intervention tend to really close that gap between students who are at risk and students who are not at risk. At the same time, older students, beyond first and second grade, also make very good progress with interventions, and also students that don't get intensive interventions for 100 hours, even just a couple of hours can really change the trajectory for students who are at risk. So again, I want to note that while early assessments are predictive, we can change the trajectory with interventions and with good teaching strategies. So I want to provide some of these resources for intervention and teaching strategies. So I have been working with a group from Haskins Labs to create a library of free resources for teachers. And these are, we created them to be especially helpful for remote teaching. The website for this resource library, it's http://haskinsglobal.org/resource-library. And there are many resources here, including resources for developing phonological awareness, which you can find at https://at.virginia.edu/3m7w F C E. This tool here is a resource for a teacher, probably in kindergarten. It just gives an example of a phonological awareness exercise. So a teacher can choose an item in the classroom or even just in the room, and then identify the beginning sound, such as t in table, and then the teacher will ask the children to identify other items in the room that share that beginning sound. And then write a number of those words that start with that sound. And again, these resources really help children build a phonological awareness. For slightly older students, there are resources for building fluency. This resource from the Meadows Center, which can be found at https://bit.ly/2HPPUGH. Here you can find some lesson plans on word recognition and fluency. So if you notice, based on students' assessments on the DIBELS, that they're struggling with fluency, these types of lesson plans here help students improve their fluency. There are also resources on the Haskins Lab library for strengthening comprehension skills. So this resource is from the National Center for Intensive Intervention at American Institutes for Research. You can find it at https://bit.ly/2HN6PVI. And this website has interventions or lesson plans and graphic organizers. This lesson in particular focuses on morphology, base words, and affixes. so we can help students improve their comprehension. So these websites are even linked to standards, and this could be helpful for students who are struggling with fluency because perhaps you've noticed that when they come to multisyllabic words, they get a little stuck. These types of lesson plans will help students decode multisyllabic words more easily, and therefore they will increase their fluency. So I want to end with encouraging you to assess your students, use the results of those assessments for instructional grouping and interventions. And in this way, I hope we can help all students reach their potential. I want to thank you for your time and attention, and I will hand it back over to Jennifer. But before I do, would like to share my contact information, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about the materials and content here. My email address is laura.reinhardt, RHINEHART, @ucla.edu. So if you're curious about some of the studies I referenced in the previous slides, you can check out these. These are the studies corresponding to the footnotes. The first study is about how these kindergarten skills predict later reading skills. The second study is referencing the subgroups or types of struggling readers I talked about, the 4 different subtypes. And the third study is the study I talked about that describes how the early interventions for children really change the trajectory of students that might be at risk of struggling with reading.
Thank you for viewing Making Reading Instruction Accessible for All Elementary School Students. Access the discussion questions to deepen your learning with your colleagues. And make sure to watch the next video in the series, Teaching Adolescent Learners Who Are Struggling to Read. Thanks.